Good morning. Welcome to St. Stephen's Episcopal Church. I am excited to be with you today. I don't know about you, but I've been having fun this summer as we've been exploring the gospel in a sort of deeper and sort of freer way than we do in church on Sunday. So I'm glad you could be with me today. What we're going to do, if you haven't joined in on these before, I invite you to go back and watch a couple of the other ones immediately preceding this one, because we're sort of diving into the same material. And while I'm going to be talking about the same stuff again, some of the same stuff again, it might be worth the refresher to go back and take the opportunity to see those as well. Now, this project, as I've seen it, is to try and stretch out the narrative aspect of the gospel. One of the things that happens when we go to church every Sunday is that either we walk into a church or we watch our church on TV or we live stream it, and we see a snippet of a story. And sometimes the stories sort of bounce around, and we don't always appreciate the narrative, that there's something happening across a whole story arc in the gospel. And so that's one of the things that I wanted to take advantage of this summer. Now, in what we've done is that we're in year B in the Revised Common Lectionary. So year B is mostly in the Gospel of Mark, though we do spend some good time in John. And that's what's happened to us this summer, is that earlier in the summer we were hanging out in Mark, and all of a sudden, now for 4 straight Sundays, we've been hanging out in John. So the people who put together the lectionary did something kind of fun, is that they found a common story between Mark and John, and they took that point in Mark, that we sort of arrive at a certain point in Mark, and then they just sort of switched. And all of a sudden we're moving on, and we're now hanging out in John for a little bit, and then we'll eventually switch back over to Mark. But the big story, the sort of the story behind the story, is that this whole summer is that we had these people that Jesus, this sort of big Jesus story, is that he has collected, he's sort of collected some followers, some close followers, to be his students. And he sent them out to do amazing things, and to do things that only he could do. And they come back and they're like, oh my gosh, it worked. And sort of meanwhile, he's starting to do more things than they anticipate, or that they can comprehend. And so they start to get scared. Like, people who are following him keep getting scared of Jesus's power, because it's different and it's greater than they anticipate. So there's a big common theme going throughout Mark in particular, of this sort of terrifying revelation of Jesus, that he can do more than what they truly want a human to be able to do, and it scares them. That's when we switch over to John here, and we switch over at one of those moments in which he does something amazing, and that is he feeds a multitude of people, over 5,000 people. Just an amazing thing. Now, what happens in this, and it's kind of a fun thing, he feeds them all. They're all fat and happy, and they can't even imagine, and then he disappears on them. He's like, oh, where'd he go? And they want to follow him. But Jesus confronts this crowd of hangers-on, because they are chasing after him, and he sort of goes at their motive, because they seem to be following him because he fed them. Kind of like, you feed a dog and then the dog comes back and is like, hey, how about more of that? As opposed to people following him because of what they actually received. Now, one of the things that happened that is another subtext of all of this, and you hear it in Mark, so it's right before we jumped into John. Jesus was describing a frustration that people were misunderstanding the relationship. They were coming to him to get healed, and they were essentially becoming a danger to each other because they were selfishly looking for their own healing or the healing of a loved one. And so the crowds were getting so big that they were pushing and trampling each other. That the autonomous singularity, the hyper-individualistic desire for personal saving was threatening the lives of the crowds. And meanwhile, Jesus is getting frustrated because this selfishness and this overwhelming desire to be healed was preventing them from seeing why Jesus was healing them. So they couldn't see, they didn't care why, they just cared that, and they wanted more of that. So in that sense, there's a way in which we classify feeding in the same way, and we might struggle to understand this. We might struggle to understand why Jesus is sort of pushing back on the crowds, both when they come to him looking to be healed, and why they come to him looking to be fed. Because we might think of ourselves as those desperate people longing to be fed or longing to be healed because we feel broken or we feel starving, and we need something. And so we don't like the idea that Jesus is like, nah, it's not like that. We don't want to hear that. So what we have here is something that's a little bit different or a little bit challenging to our preconceptions as well, not just theirs, because we might internalize this as the sort of sole purpose, or we might internalize this as about matters of justice or ministry or evangelism, that we need to heal people. We're about healing, we're about feeding, we're about doing for other people. So this is about other people. This is about just doing and doing and doing. So the idea that Jesus would have something beyond this is insulting, because healing is, for many of us, the purpose, right? So these are some of the challenges we might have when we hear what Jesus is doing or what Jesus is saying here. And so I welcome those, and I welcome us to explore that. But I'm going to stick with why Jesus seems to be challenging that idea, and we'll talk about that right here. He's challenging it because they're tied. Healing and feeding is tied around something central, and he needs to help. In Mark, he's helping teach them this. In John, he's sort of saying, how you are doing it for this, you should be doing it for this, right? He's trying to demonstrate and describe where they ought to be putting their minds and their hearts, which is not around the selfish consumption of more bread, but in a mind to learn why Jesus is healing and what is happening when Jesus heals these people or Jesus feeds these people. And at the sort of central thesis of this is that Jesus doesn't feed these people and Jesus doesn't heal these people. God does. God does this through him. So God is healing and God is feeding, and they need to separate this idea and the idea of meeting their need. There's them finding their needs met. They need to separate that from the idea that they can find it from Jesus. That this dynamic Jesus is confronting. So, what is he confronts this because the purpose, his reason for being there is that God has sent him there to be the means by which people could know that God is with them and that God can be a place of a means of healing and saving and feeding, right? And this piece and so Jesus is trying to help them understand this. So he goes into this whole chapter 6, the bread of life discourse, is this whole sequence in which Jesus is explaining to these crowds of people. And here at the end, we discover it sort of shifts to a synagogue as he's talking. So these are people at the seashore, and then by the end of it, we, the reader, are transported into a synagogue where he is teaching. He's trying to help them understand that the sort of God is at the center of all of this. Jesus is the means by which we can sort of acknowledge that God is present, and that this allows us to understand the relationship, the central dynamic of relationship to this story, right? And so that Jesus' relationship to God allows them to have access to God, right? Through Jesus, right? And then others are able to gain access to God through them, and then others through those others, and others through those others, right? And so all the way, so that's how we can go from God at one end to us in the 21st century at the other end of the spectrum, because we've been able to connect through other people, right? So this relationship component of connecting to God by connecting through neighbor is the sort of central thing. He confronts them about their desires, right, for being fed, rather than recognizing that God was there. You're so busy focusing on the food, you can't see God. You're so busy trying to fill your bellies again that you can't see that God did this. Right? So this is the sort of central piece. Another aspect that's worth bringing up, it sort of brought it up before, but Jesus brings it up again in this. So he brings it up several times throughout this. He's interweaving this idea of bread that they just yesterday ate. They ate a bunch of bread, miraculous bread, right? So they have bread on their minds. They want more miraculous bread. So he's talking about bread, right? He brings up, and they discuss Moses, which is a similar dynamic in which, and he brings up a particular story from Exodus 16, where they have just been freed from Egypt, and the Hebrew people are wandering around in the desert, and they're super hungry, and they want Moses to save them. They want Moses to go do this. Go find God wherever you find God. Go find God and get God to fix our hunger. And so he makes this connection, right? He's deeply connecting this because he wants them to connect that the Hebrew people misunderstood the relationship to Moses in the way that they're mistaking the relationship to Jesus right now, right? Moses didn't make the manna appear, this manna being this cakey, bready, substance that fed everybody. Much like the feeding of the multitudes, everyone got to get their fill. It wasn't just tiny little bits. They were able to eat and eat and eat until they were ready to be done, and they filled themselves up and they were satiated, right? That is the purpose. Moses didn't create that. In the same way that Jesus doesn't create this, God creates this. And Jesus is the means by which they're able to recognize it happening. Same way that maybe without Moses it doesn't happen, but Moses doesn't create it, right? God does it. So the focus needs to be on God, not on the means by which God comes in. So he's very much trying to guide them into this and to say, I'm doing something here that will help you understand this is about God. This is not about you, and it's not truly about me, it's about God. That's our central thesis. The last two things I want to talk about are to bring up this other thing that happens throughout this whole thing, is that we tend to see metaphor and literal. We sort of see these as two opposing buckets. It's either a metaphor and it's meaningless. Its meaning is it's meaning. It's not to have anything beyond meaning. It's not supposed to have any physical reality. Metaphors are just sort of ephemeral. Literal is factual and actual, and you can just possess it and eat it or break it or whatever, right? Literal is the substance, in my hands, right? Jesus really is pushing us to care less about the distinction between literal and metaphor. He really dives into this idea of calling himself bread and calling his blood, his flesh is eatable, his blood is drinkable, right? He's not, of course, inviting them to be cannibals, but it has this sort of the sense in which he's driving this image so hard throughout this whole chapter that it really ought to have you go and recognize metaphors as being more important than just, some little flitting idea. That there's something really deep here. That's the sort of substance of this. But I want us to where I hope we might land today is not on the sort of getting lost in the literal or the metaphorical, or to get lost in the details of eternal life and bread of life, or into any of these other pieces, or to dismiss any of it. I want us to sort of hold in all of the tension that comes with this, that Jesus is dealing with people who are confronting him and confronting this, the very nature of what he's up to. And that this is not about 5,000 individuals in their individual little homes getting their fill and then being able to turn it off, and then to come back later, turn it on, and get their fill. Right? There's this image of coming and being fed and zoning out. In a sense, the image of us arriving at church, virtually or physically, church one day a week, connecting with God, and then turning around, and the 6 days and 23 hours is spent not communing with God. That feels anathema to what Jesus is describing here. It feels very much like what Jesus is confronting here. So I invite us into this tension, the tension of what it means to be fed. I invite you to sort of debate with yourself that sort of sensation of why you want something, why you come to something, not to sort of question it as a negative thing, but to say, am I doing what do I do just to get what I want? When Jesus is inviting us to think not only of what you want, but what we want, right? He didn't feed 5,000 individuals. He fed a multitude. He fed a gathered people longing. He doesn't send his disciples out to, a couple of people over here and a couple of people over here in hopes that those people might change their individual lives. He sends his disciples out to the nations so that the world might be overcome with the grace and peace of God. There's a real deep, convicting story here that I hope we all take the opportunity to work on this week. God's grace be with you, Christ's peace be with you, and the Spirit's outpouring be with you now and always. Amen.